Hello, heathens, heretics, and other unbelieving riffraff. Welcome to Veritas Voices. I am Lilith. I'm here with Renee, of course. And we are here to talk about the resurrection of Jesus and claims of the empty tomb. If you've ever talked to a Christian who wanted to convince you, the empty tomb is often one of the things they'll bring up right away. With many assumptions, many interesting assumptions in the apologetic behind. And Renee found an excellent article bringing up some of these details, and I thought we could go over it together. So thank you,
Yeah,
Renee.
it's sort of an 8-point checklist or 8-point list that supposedly demonstrates that there was an empty tomb. And I was thinking, well, these ones are something that an apologist could bring up. And while we are not historians or experts or anything like that, we do have our opinions and we do have our views on these various points on this list. So we are both gonna say what we think about each point, and the article will be linked below within the description box. So, yeah, I suggest we
Absolutely.
get right to it.
I agree. Now, I've noticed a lot of the assumptions behind a lot of what Christians say. And to be honest, the Christian on the street who has heard this from an apologist often has the impression they're citing more historical sources than they are, in fact, citing.
Yeah.
But one theme I've noticed through through the entire article, through all of the reasons given, and all of the points that imaginary atheists apparently put up against their perspective, is this assumption of what would have been done.
Yeah.
And I've heard this from pastors. When I first told my pastor that I had become an atheist, they were like, I was pointing out all these inconsistencies in the Gospels, and they're like, oh, well, they would have been able to check. They would have, if that was wrong, someone would have corrected them. And
Yeah.
I felt like saying, so spread across the Mediterranean, a group of largely illiterate people passing rumors around would have been able to fact check them and do
Yeah.
so accurately in their writings.
And they also assume that if they were in the local area, and also oftentimes that they were eyewitnesses. And a lot of these assumptions, I think, will become immediately apparent as soon as we tack the points, because there are a lot of underlying assumptions which Christians would probably take for granted, but which I don't think hold up historically, and which I don't think an atheist or people who don't accept the empty tomb or don't accept the resurrection would necessarily accept.
Certainly, and even rational Christians don't tend to use the, well, certainly someone would have told someone and that would have been
Yeah,
fixed before it ever got to print, kind
yeah,
of excuses. It's yeah, there are groups that do that and there are groups that don't.
yeah,
I gotta say, it's, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just a little bit face palming here, but it's
yeah,
fine. I'm fine.
yeah. So in the beginning, they sort of do an introduction, and then they present like a list where, and I think the first reason they call it the Jerusalem factor. Do you think we should read it out as a whole, or should we?
Well, I don't think we can read the entire article word for word, but we can certainly summarize the points.
Yeah,
This, I should mention, on crossexamine.org. It's part of a series. They had previously covered the death of Jesus, the crucifixion, the evidence for that. So they're coming in with we've already demonstrated this beyond the shadow of a doubt. So now we move on to the empty tomb.
yeah,
And this is, so, it's like part 4 of the larger apologetic series.
Yeah,
Um, now, yeah, but the Jerusalem factor I found really interesting, where it says that all four Gospels attest Jesus crucified and buried in Jerusalem, of course.
yeah,
Um, now, the second sentence here says history tells us that Christianity had a lot of opposition in the first century, both the Jews and the Roman government. Um, I'm very interested in this history tells us because it appears to be, well, it's
the
a rather
Gospels.
unsighted and broad history.
Yeah. I mean, what they mean when they say history tells us is the Bible or the Gospels.
They do. Well, they mean acts. And the Acts of the Apostles, interesting point just to throw in here. There were a wide number of Acts of the Apostles circulating in the early church, and only the one that was associated with the gospel attributed to Luke made it into the canon. Some of them were so wildly mythical that apologists even now are apologizing for them. They'll try and use them as a source while laughing in their sleeve at them openly. It's very awkward. Uh, but, that's always
Yeah.
interesting.
What I found interesting was a little bit after that, where they talked about the enemies of Christianity and how they could have gone to the tomb and simply present Jesus' corpse, and then Christianity would have been dead. But what I ask myself, and this would be an objection which I would never raise, is what tomb? How
Hmm.
do they know that there was a tomb that they could have gone to in order to find the corpse? Because I don't
Exactly.
think that there was a tomb that
No,
they
I
could
don't
have
think
gone
so
to.
either. I don't think so
Like
either. And
they already assumed that there was a tomb who they could go to and then just obliterate Christianity, when I don't think that was the case at all.
well, and there's an important point here that you need to understand. Those who are not well versed in the Bible story, um, this is an important thing to understand when anyone's talking about the empty tomb in the early church. They have one source, Acts of the Apostles, written by the same author that wrote Luke. So
Yes.
it is in that story, there are, the apostles huddling alone, and then the Spirit comes on them like tongues of fire, and they all start speaking in tongues, which in this story means they're speaking in other languages that they don't really know, but they don't realize it. And they're just speaking to the crowd and preaching. And so everyone hears their own language because, of course, it's a festival and there's lots of visiting people.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, then there's this huge thing, and they I'm sorry, I should have grabbed my Bible beforehand, but they name thousands of people getting saved and baptized on the first day. And they'll mention men, so of course modern speakers are quite happy to double it for women and children, or triple it even. The thing is, this is a mythical account. This is not reality. And we can see it's not reality from several different things. Among them, the actual history of the region. Now, I'm not saying there were no first century Christians in Jerusalem. There were.
Yeah.
But if in one day or even one week, say a third of the local population, and we can tell roughly what the population of Jerusalem would have been at that time, even swollen with pilgrims. If a third of that population had suddenly adopted a new religion in the course of a week, there is no way no one would have noticed,
And it would have been
especially in
recorded by
such,
historians, I presume.
yeah, in such a tumultuous region. There's no way someone wouldn't have written a note to someone, that there wouldn't have been a, discourse about how to deal with this or whether to just let it blow over. There are lots of, yeah, there's no reason to believe this has anything to do with reality at all. It is one account in one book of the Bible, which was written long after the events. Luke is not the last of the Gospels written, that's John, but it's certainly not the first either.
Yeah.
Um, you know, second century at the earliest. And so we've got all of these assumptions are based on one story
Yeah.
from one account of the Acts of the Apostles, which was only included because it was the least ridiculous and obviously mythical of the ones available.
Yeah.
And that's it. And there's no corroborating evidence in history. There's no corroborating anything. So when they say history says, I put in snotty quotation marks, you have to understand very often that's all they're referring to is Acts. And Acts is not fact.
Yes. And as far as I'm concerned, like what they are putting out sort of as a defense for the Jerusalem factor is pretty much a straw man of what atheists would raise, and it's not something that would be relevant to an argument against the empty tomb that I would make, for instance.
Certainly, certainly. And in fairness, I don't entirely think that any person on the street would necessarily know when an apologist says history says that all they're referring to is the Bible. I mean, when I was a Christian, a young, zealous Christian, I talked about the 500 witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus until I figured out and found out that the only source to that is an offhand remark in one of
From
Paul's
Paul.
letters.
Yeah.
That like names no one, names no location, names no, oh no, totes like 500 people all at the same time. And I'm like, cool
Yeah.
story, bro.
And remember, it was also a letter, so he wrote to people who were remote from the region who probably wouldn't have bothered checking out the area where the eyewitnesses could have been found. And even if they did went there, and in Jerusalem there were thousands of people, so good luck finding these 500.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean 500, it doesn't name a single one. It doesn't even say Paul was among them. It says, and indeed, by his own accounts, he
He
couldn't have
wasn't.
been, because this was when the resurrection appearances were happening before, or presumably before the ascension, and Paul wasn't even involved in Christianity at that point. Yeah, so it's, yeah, a completely unsighted, random throwaway line that, would convince nobody, at a bar of a story someone was telling. Like it's wildly,
Yeah.
wildly poor citation there.
And
Um,
especially if like numbers like 500 instead of, I don't know, 784 would be cited, that alone could or should make you skeptical that it's such
yeah,
an even number.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's clearly just an estimation of
Yeah.
at best, an
Yeah.
estimation of a story told around. At worst, just someone desperately trying to give more validity to their position.
Yeah.
But yeah, this whole argument is though, why didn't they just go to the grave and dig up his corpse and parade it through the street? And
My answer to that would be, what grave? Where? Where was it? Where
yeah,
could they have gone? How do you know that there was even a grave?
well, and that's the thing too, is that the story in the Gospels very much includes a specific grave. But anyone who's researched this knows that the Romans did not let criminals, common criminals, executed in this manner in crucifixion. A true Roman who was beheaded might be given back to their family for burial.
Yeah.
Um, People crucified, they were just thrown in a common pit.
Yeah.
So if that happened to Jesus, which we'll see later in the article, is even their own evidence shows is the more likely occurrence in reality, what they're going to dig some random corpse out of the no. Also, especially because dead bodies were considered unclean by everyone, by the Jews especially. No one would do that. There would be no point in doing that. That's an absurd claim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think we can safely conclude that the Jerusalem factor isn't really a factor at all.
No.
So,
Mythical tale happens in legendary sacred city. Oh, behold my shock.
I don't know if you're aware of this is just a side note, but there's this YouTube channel, Jesus Never Existed, and he usually ends with, is it history? No, it's just more nonsense from the New Testament.
Yeah,
That's
more amazing rubbish from the Bible. I'm like, yep.
Yeah. But anyways, then they move on to reason number 2. It was, after all, the women who witnessed the empty tomb first, and by the criteria of embarrassment, that means that it magically has more validity. What would you say about that?
You mean besides the rapid urge to face palm repeatedly?
Yeah.
Okay, the horrible attitude of the Jews historically towards women aside, there are several reasons this is absurd. First of all, a lot of people don't know or refuse to accept this, but the Gospels and Acts were written by Greeks, not Jews.
Yeah.
These were people, they might have been Jewish Greeks, but these were people with a high level of Greek education. They weren't
Yeah.
just literate as in they could read or even that they could write, they could compose. These were stages in education, and having the ability to actually be trained in how to compose a tale, a story of this level, and write it down in the classical style is not something everybody had, not something everybody could have had. To pretend otherwise is just to be completely dishonest about the entire nature of the circumstance. Women in those days, not necessarily respected as much as men, of course, but they were also, in Greek culture at least, not considered as inferior. Even if there was, less, we could compare modern Islamic states with Sharia law, where the testimony of 2 women is required for a man. Well, depending on which account you read, you have up to 5 women. And then the men still go and verify after the fact. So this is a very weak excuse. And also the whole idea that the women are going to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body, that's what women would do. Men would not do that. It would
Back
have
in the
been
days.
strange to write men into that. If you were just making up the story wholesale, you would not write men into that role because men don't do that.
It was back in the day the women's job to take care of the bodies of dead people, and yeah,
Absolutely. It's a
it would have
shit
raised
job.
more
We get it.
suspicion to include men in that. Like, that would have raised significantly more skepticism for a story, which we should already be skeptical about because it goes against the laws of nature. But
Mm-hmm.
but one thing which I also want to say about that, the story is, I think it was part of the Gospel of Matthew, right? With the women.
Which one?
Uh, like, I think the thing that the woman discovered, Jesus' body, I think it was also, at least, it was part of, I think, the Gospel of Matthew, and
It
also,
was in all of them,
yeah,
to various degrees.
yeah,
The women were the first to the tomb and then ran
yeah,
back and either didn't tell anyone or did and weren't
yeah.
believed, and then disciples come. Yeah.
But I think it was in the Gospel of Matthew, and as well. No, I think I confused that. It was also in the Gospel of Mark. And one theme that also runs rampant throughout Mark was this whole motive of the last shall be first and the first shall be last.
Mm-hmm.
So
Oh, yeah.
this would also sort of fit into the narrative, like you also see it with Joseph of Arimathea. He, the person who previously voted against or for Jesus to be crucified, now is the person who saves the day. The woman who would normally not be, who are not the most reliable people or the most reliable witnesses, and who don't enjoy a very good place in society, they are the ones who discover Jesus. So this also fits in with this general theme that we see all throughout
I
the
think that's an
gospel.
excellent point. The least among you all is the greatest. Who will not
Yeah,
become like a little child will not enter heaven. That
yeah,
whole, yeah, that the certain versions certainly of the gospels do make a real point of turning social norms on their head, which is one of the better things about Christianity, in that it,
yeah,
it kind of, it's very interesting in that regard, and I think subversive in the best way.
yeah,
But then, yeah, that you can hardly complain that it subverts a social norm if that's the entire point of the frickin' religion.
yeah. And that's also what Jesus preached, that the last shall be first. And then you see over and over again, here are the women, the last shall be first. Jesus was right again.
Yeah, yeah, you could absolutely sell it that way. Absolutely. And
Yeah,
that's so there's no reason to find the women anything but expected. If you were inventing the narrative to be spiritual, you would put the least to be first. If you
yeah,
were inventing it to be plausible, women are the only ones that deal with dead bodies. There would be no reason to have it any other way. Um,
yeah.
and also the plausibility of relying solely on their testimony. They never rely solely on the women's testimony. The women go, "Oh my goodness," and run back and get the men.
And then you also have the men who obviously stand beside the women and then say, yeah, that's how it happens, or that's how
Yeah,
it happened. Now you have the testimony of men again.
exactly, exactly. So it cycles around about. A great deal of fuss is made over this, and it's a remarkably weak point. I'm always shocked by how much is attempted to be, how much is made out of this when it's like,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway,
Well,
sorry.
I think one stronger point would be reason number three. It's not a point that persuaded me, but I, at least I would say give credit where credit is due. I think that is within this article a stronger point than most of the other points. So, what do you think about
Regrettably, that's not a very high
standard?
standard, but yeah. Okay, the reason three is that the enemies of Christianity presuppose the vacancy of the tomb when they said that the disciples stole the body.
Well,
Okay,
what's
so
our
what
source
about
for
this
that?
impressed you?
Well, it did impress me initially because if that were the case, then obviously that would be good evidence for it. But I was just gonna ask you, what is our source for that? That the enemies presuppose the vacancy of the tomb. What's the evidence for that?
The Bible story that we're taking all of our information from.
Yeah,
That's, yeah, that's the point. It's funny. None of the Pharisees at that time, who, by the way, did write, and Jesus stole a lot of his lines from them, apparently. They wrote their theological debates and commentary on things that were going on. None of them said, "Oh, the disciples stole the body." They didn't even reference Jesus at any point. None of the Jewish writings and none of the Roman writings contemporaneous at that time had any reference to that. Um, yeah, it's something that comes in the Bible and nowhere else.
yeah.
So
But one thing
yeah,
which they did bring up was that Matthew probably couldn't have been lying, because if he was lying, then people could have easily fact checked him. But again, that would presuppose that Matthew was actually writing in proximity to the general area, that people could have easily gone there and confirmed with the other people, with the enemies, and they would have said, no, we didn't attest to that at all. So
Well, and the
this again makes
absurdity
so
of
many
that is
assumptions.
we know, and that there's been a great deal of effort to ignore this fact. But the epistles, many of them were written before 70 AD. And the big thing in 70 AD was the fall of Jerusalem.
Yeah,
The Gospels were written after, not only, and we don't just know that because there are prophetic predictions of the fall of the temple, but because some of the ways that Jewish religion, it talks about the Jewish religion being practiced, were ways that were not actually normal until after the fall of the temple cult.
yeah,
Um, Behaviors with regards to synagogues and stuff. The authors didn't know better. They went with what Judaism was at the time, not what it had been prior to that.
yeah,
There were several ways that we know they were all written after the fall of Jerusalem. So even presuming that witnesses to these things lived in and around Jerusalem or anywhere near that area of the Holy Land,
yeah,
there's at least a 70% chance that they would have been slaughtered by the Roman war machine, possibly made slaves and sent to, the bottom of a ship somewhere, uh, mostly all dead. A few of them perhaps run away and captured and made slaves somewhere else. It there's no possibility whatsoever that you could go back to the neighborhood, knock on the door of, Jimmy and say, "Hey, I heard you were involved in that thing that happened 40 years ago. What's the story there, bruh?"
yeah.
No,
And
zero possibility.
one thing which I sort of got hung up upon was the following. I want to read it. If
Mm.
the anti-Christian Jews were not making the accusation that there was an empty tomb, sort of, then Matthew could have easily been falsified. People could have gone to the Jewish leadership and asked them, "Where in the Gospel of Matthew that you deny Jesus was from the dead? You explain this empty tomb by saying they saw the body. Is this true?" If it was true, the Jewish leadership could have said, "What? We said no such thing. What are you talking about?" Would Matthew really open himself up to such easy falsification?
Of
And
course he would. What
and
it? Ugh.
the issue that I have with that is how many people back in the day could actually read.
Yeah,
Not
this
many.
is
How many people back in the day would have gone through the trouble of going to Jerusalem and asking people, "Hey, is this really the case?" Like, would they have been skeptical if they read it in the Gospel of Matthew?
even
Where was the
okay. And
Gospel of
I
Matthew
would like
written there?
to note that in the second century, when some Romans were noticing this obnoxious little cult of Christianity, they were constantly commenting on how superstitious these people were, easily willing to accept any little magician's trick that seemed to line up with whatever they believed. So these were not highly skeptical individuals. We're assuming not only that they wanted to practice a level of skepticism and verification that would be expected in, say, a university student today, which is absurd, but that they would have had the resources. How many people in all of the Roman Empire would have, no matter how much they wished, have been able to pick up, go to Jerusalem, spend time and money tracking down whoever the hell was involved in this or their descendants or whoever else? And I'm not saying that nobody was that educated and wealthy in the Roman Empire, but they weren't Christians if they were.
Yeah. And I think this point really just fails at the fact that not only would have Matthew opened himself up to quote unquote easy falsification, or I should better say that he didn't open himself up to easy falsification, because it would not at all have been easily falsified, given when he wrote it and given the fact that, that people probably wouldn't have been skeptical. A lot of people wouldn't have even read the Gospels, and who would have gone through the trouble of seeking these people out.
Well, and I used for comparison the example of Washington, George Washington, the first president of the United States, very well-known historic figure. The year of his death, the exact same year, there came out a biography of his story, the story of his life, and it included the story of when he was a young boy and chopped down a cherry tree, but he wouldn't lie to his father when his father asked.
Yeah.
This story is part of the sort of the mythos surrounding his character, but it's apocryphal. It never happened. There's no reason to believe it ever actually happened. It was, taking an admired figure and putting a story together that would encourage children to be honest. But it's stayed part of the popular mythos. And for some people a lot of people probably actually believe it happened. It certainly did in the past believe it happened. And this is in a time of literacy where, while it was not as easy to travel and gather information, it was easier. It wasn't as easy as it is now, but it certainly was easier than it would have been in first century Rome on the Mediterranean. And yet, this wasn't questioned. This didn't have a bunch of skeptics beating down doors over it. Stories, apocryphal stories, make it into all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And I don't even necessarily have so much of a problem with that, or I wouldn't if people didn't expect me to base my entire life around them.
Yeah. And I completely agree. Just one more thing that I want to touch on this on reason number 3, and then I say we move on to reason number 4. They also cite that the enemy at the station is actually multiplayer tested. Like, they bring up just Martyr's dialogue with Trypho and Tertullian as sort of people who can also confirm it outside of the gospel.
Yeah, and
what do you think about that?
It's absurd because you have some second century sources that refer to Christians. They don't even refer to Jesus, they refer to Christ, which is the title, not the name. This is an important distinction. And they refer to Christians talking about worshiping someone they refer to as Christ, again, a title, not a name, who was crucified and resurrected.
Yeah.
That is the most basic point in Christian doctrine. All they are attesting is that Christians existed. That's it. There were Christians in the 1st and 2nd century. No, you don't say. And they believed that Jesus had died and rose again. They weren't talking about an actual empty tomb and actually something that they had independently. So they said, this is this group Christians. I asked them what they believe. They believe this.
Yeah.
Nothing about that is surprising. Nothing about that is a unique, separate attestation to the actual empty tomb. That's saying, hey, Christians exist and they believe in a resurrected dude who was crucified. They say it was under Pilate.
Yeah.
That's it.
And one thing which I would also say about that, since they bring up this, or since the article claims that they lend support to these, to the enemy at the station, is that these two people wrote in the 150s and in the 200s.
Mm-hmm.
So these people as well, who were also Christians, they would have had the Gospel of Matthew available to them. And that's presumably where they got the claim from that there's enemy at the station.
Yeah, and the whole idea that someone noticing the existence of Christians and repeating the most basic element of what they believed is somehow an attestation of that belief being true is, I mean, it's absurd. It's like saying, oh, there were some weird people chanting Hare Krishna at the airport in the 70s, so that means that their doctrine is totally verified. What? No, they're just because there were bald people wearing white outfits and chanting Hare Krishna doesn't actually mean that the teachings are true. It just means there were some people who believed that and they were acting strange. Actually, but more to the point of this type of quoting sources, frankly, very dishonestly and very loosely. Back in the first point, I just want to bring this up because I actually found it very interesting, where it was all about, why didn't they just parade the body through the streets, as if Jews would ever do that with a dead body. They did not do that. They mention Lucian of Samosata, and they say such this would certainly have been picked up by Lucian of Samosata, who was ridiculing Christianity in his work and would have loved to use such an instance as evidence against the Christians' claims. And I admit they didn't, in order to make this claim, you have to do no research at all into Lucian, because Lucian of Samosata was a satirist who satirized religious beliefs. He made all kinds of ridiculous satires about the gods, about the Greek mythologies. Yet today, people go up on about he made one casual reference to Christianity. And it showed very little understanding of their actual doctrines. It's just saying that they worshipped an actual man as opposed to a god. And he didn't take the trouble to delve into their doctrines because it wasn't worth it. Christians vastly overestimate the importance of early Christianity to first and even second century Rome. You were not important. They were not important back then. They were some small, weird cult that, basically like my mention of Hare Krishna. It was the same level of throwaway, whatever, weirdos. Literally that. And I read the passage that he wrote, or, well, a translation of it, obviously. That's all. So the thinking that, this man who barely, didn't even research the basic doctrines of Christianity would have dug up this obscure reference to something maybe happening, and totally, if it had happened, he would know about it. What? Where do you get this from?
Well, right. I presume they get it from apologists. But anyways, then they bring up a fourth reason. The empty tomb is multiply attested, and the multiple attestations are the Synoptic Gospels, the Gospel of John, and the early creed cited in 1 Corinthians 15. What would you... Are you okay?
So, the few books of the Bible that were specifically selected because they sort of agreed with each other and Orthodox doctrine, out of the many writings available, and there were many writings available, they agree with each other on a major point of doctrine.
Calling me surprised.
I'm shocked. This is my shocked face.
Yeah. Which we unfortunately cannot see right now, but yeah.
I'll put up the meme. Oh my God. I just can't even. Can't even. It's not multiply attested if it's just in your sacred writings.
Yeah.
The existence of Lord Brahma, the creator, is multiply attested in the 4 Vedas and the Bhagavad Gita. So become a Hindu now.
Yeah. I would say about that the synoptic gospels are obviously not independent. I mean, there's no dispute among that. And the article also cites the synoptic gospel as pretty much one source, which is a start, I guess. But I would also say that given that the Gospel of John was written so much later than the Gospel of Mark, like I think 40 to 50 years later, I think that's what accurate. I think 40 years later was the number, I think. Right?
I'm not entirely sure. I would have to verify the dates on that again.
Yeah.
But to pretend that,
But
among
I
all
think
the writings,
but I think John at least would have been, well, maybe he didn't borrow from, or we know that he didn't uh, use the Gospels of Mark, Luke, and Matthew as a source. At the
oh, he
very
used
least,
a bit of Mark as a source, but
yeah.
not
But
to the same degree.
at the very least, he would have been aware of the empty tomb thing written in
Yeah,
that
gee, the
gospel.
most basic doctrine of Christianity is written about in Christian writings.
Yeah, he would have been
Shocked.
he would have been aware of the doctrine of the empty tomb by the time he would have written the gospel. So I wouldn't say that John is an independent source in that regard.
No.
Like I would say he is an independent source insofar as he didn't necessarily borrow from the other gospels or he didn't copy stuff, but he isn't an independent source insofar as that he's coming as a neutral person and he's attesting to the empty tomb and he already knew about the empty tomb and I
Of
presume he knew
course he
about
did.
the empty tomb from.
Well, this is the thing. You have Christian sources, which are actually, again, selected scriptures. Selected. You've got all these sources that are, pruned out. And then you have the sacred writings, just them.
Yeah.
And yet, no, there's no historical basis. Like, if you go look in history just for the most casual incidental verification, I heard about this weird thing happening, that you would expect to find just smallest thing. I mean, Apollonius of Tyana, we have from him, someone writing a letter to someone else saying, yeah, I heard about this weird guy, he actually seems pretty cool, I listened to him talk. We don't have that for Jesus. We
Yeah.
don't have any of this. So, look, Christians, we have many reasons why we don't believe the Gospels are a reliable source. If you want to know why any particular atheist doesn't believe that, please ask them.
Yeah.
But Acts is the same thing as the Gospels. It was written as a sequel to Luke, okay? We don't find any of that reliable historically. You're going to need to come up with factual corroborating evidence. I'm not talking about someone who noticed that Christians existed in the 2nd century and, worshiped Jesus, because that was totally shocking. I'm talking about, if thousands of people converted in one area in one day, there would be some sign of that, some incidental thing. Mundane corroborating facts. There was a movie I watched several years ago. It was about the trial with regard to a man who had been enslaved in Africa. This was back when slavery was legal, but the slave trade wasn't.
Yeah.
You could own slaves that were born slaves, but you couldn't kidnap people from Africa and bring them across. And in the trial, he, tells the story of being brought across in this boat. And of course, that's very illegal. And he tells at one point, at one point he had been taken from a plantation. So yeah, they were trying to ascertain how accurate his story was. And At one point, he talks about how rations had been minimized. They didn't have enough food, so they only fed the ones that looked healthy. And then one day on the deck, they bring like half the slaves up, chained together, and then throw them all into the sea. Basically, they just horrible. They throw the ball chain over, and everyone gets dragged to the bottom of the ocean. It's dreadful.
Yeah.
And they're trying to find evidence for this or against it, because of course people are saying that never happened. Why would they do that? They're losing all this profit. And yet the mundane records kept of the ship and of the weight of the ship and how it affected, when they set off, the weight of the cargo, and when they arrived, the weight of the cargo, there was suddenly this huge drop. And they were interviewing the man who was bringing forward these records, and they said, what do you think could have caused this? Well, if they found they had not brought enough food and lightened themselves of the weight of those they did not wish to continue to feed, that would account for it. So you have this mundane bookkeeping detail. What is the weight of your cargo leaving port? What is the weight of your cargo coming in? That corroborated the story. Those types of mundane details never corroborate any of the stories in Christianity. Those things that we would have basic records of, minor, incidentals of life, never corroborate any of these stories. That's the kind of thing that I would find convincing. I would find it not necessarily convincing of the whole of Christianity, but if they supported some particular story, I would find that I'd say, okay, well, clearly this story is not totally made up. Something validates this. Let's look into it a little further, see how much of it can be relied on. But I wouldn't just discount it.
Yes. It would at the very least be worth a second look.
Oh, certainly. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would take anything validated like that in the Christian claims by the sort of mundane details and records that are kept all the time and have to be kept just for the functioning of life, I would take seriously. I would look into that in great detail. I would be very interested to hear that.
Yeah. Okay, so do you think, do you want to say anything else about reason number 4, or should we move on to number 5?
I think we should move on to number 5 because I've been rambling a little bit.
Yeah. So reason number 5, Mark's account is simple and lacks signs of embellishment. Well, first
It's
of all,
nice of them to disprove Christianity for us like this.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I would say, even if, so what? That doesn't mean anything. And second of all, I wouldn't think that the Gospel of Mark as a whole, or even the account about the empty tomb, would be simple or lacking any sort of embellishment. I mean, there was a lot of sunshine, there was a stranger in a white robe, and the women were alarmed and they ran away and didn't tell anyone. Why would they be alarmed by a man in a white robe if that wasn't something special?
One of the reasons that
And
we
also,
know...
again, there's also, again, this theological motive that we touched on earlier: the last shall be first and the first shall be last. So
Absolutely.
that could again also be argued to be a sort of embellishment.
Well, and if you read the Gospels in the order written, you see the myth grow. Mark is relatively unembellished. Matthew and Luke take the story off in different directions, but both become more magical. By the time you get to John, you've got Super Jesus, the God who, and magics everything and is honestly kind of a douche. There's a clear growth of the myth. So the first step in that isn't as dramatic as the last step.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for telling us why we shouldn't rely on the Gospels. Good job, Craig. This particular point was explained by Dr. William Lane Craig. So thank you once again for giving us another
Yeah.
reason not to believe the Gospels.
And also one thing which I did also want to say about the Gospel of Mark. Mark is trying to sell us a fucking resurrection here. The rest should be realistic so that we should buy it. Because if the other stuff within the Gospels as batshit crazy as that proposition, then people are less likely to buy into it.
Yeah. Maybe Mark just got really high like the author of Revelations.
Yeah.
Sorry. Um, but that's it's a very weak point. I don't even know why they
Yeah.
included it. But I
And
want to
it's
move on
also
to
a point that I would also kind of dispute, but not dispute that much. I think there's a little bit of embellishment, but not that much embellishment that I would.
well, compared to John there isn't, but we practice,
Yeah, compared to.
zoomed off into the like Superman, you're fine. Okay,
Yeah,
yeah, it's less embellished than Superman.
I mean,
Um
the Gospel of John shouldn't be the standard.
the standard for face palming, maybe.
Yeah,
Reason six ties into that too, is that it's multiple literary forms. It's repeated as a miracle, a creed, didactic, and apocalyptic. I'm going, seriously?
yeah. So what?
I don't know why this would make it more reliable. Why would this make it more reliable? What is I spent 30 years believing this and trying to validate my belief, don't understand why that's supposed to be convincing.
Yeah, it's. Yeah, I don't know what to say about that. It's not relevant to me at all, especially since, yeah, it's part of John, it's part of a creed, it's part of Acts. Yeah. So what? Like it's yeah, there are many literary forms, therefore it's true.
Mm-hmm. I have to admit, reason seven is amusing because it brings back the point of the women. Do you want to start this one?
Uh, yeah, I think this one can again be contributed to. Yeah, that it simply makes sense given the context of the past, where it was just the women's job to take care of the bodies.
Yeah, but read the excuse here. The reason the Gospels say the women went to begin the lends credence to the accounts because it was standard practice of Jews to anoint the bodies of dead friends and family members.
Yeah,
Um, the reasons, okay. So why didn't they go on Saturday? It was the Sabbath. The shops were closed. They couldn't buy perfumes and ointments to anoint the body. They would have had to wait till Sunday when the shops were open before they could get the perfumes. Okay.
yeah,
Uh, again, this is more reason to doubt the story because who's going to be up first thing in the morning and able to buy funerary anointings? And there's a whole thing about the anointing of Jesus and the super anointing and the re-anointing and the later anointing that just makes this entire excuse rather incoherent.
yeah,
But the principle of historical fit or coherence is applicable here. The entire point of calling a day and a half in the tomb 3 days was that he rested on the Sabbath and that everybody else had to rest on the Sabbath, that they couldn't do anything on the Sabbath, that they had to get him into the tomb before the Sabbath. Of course, they didn't go on Saturday and make themselves ritually unclean on the Sabbath. It So the story isn't incoherent in one of the main points that they make the biggest deal about and focus on endlessly.
yeah. Yeah, it's Christian apologetics for you.
Renee the Stupid hurts.
Yeah, it's only two more reasons to go. So I would say that we make it quick and
Oh,
hopefully
yeah.
not
Okay,
too
let's
painful.
quickly put this out of its misery because I'm going to lose it. Okay,
Yeah,
reason 8, the edict, which I
archaeological
actually
evidence.
didn't know about. I found this very interesting. Just you go. I'm going to face
Yeah,
palm a few times.
I I did find this sort of persuasive when I first read it, but I would say that they argue that there was an edict uh, that was sort of given by Emperor Claudius, AD 49 till 54, that graves shouldn't be disturbed or bodies shouldn't be removed from tombs. And the punishment for doing so was death. And what the article then argues is that this would be a very extreme reaction for removing a body from a tomb or disturbing graves, but so there must have been something significant happening that the punishment would be so harsh back in the day, and the best explanation for that would be Jesus and the empty tomb. What I would say about that is, well, that was 2,000 years ago, and 2,000 years ago, you were pretty much put to death for everything, right? I mean, you were put to death for cursing your parents, you were put to death for adultery, you were put to death for all kinds of stuff.
Okay, this was a Roman edict.
Yeah. And what I would say is stealing bodies also has something to do with respect for the dead and respect for people and respect also for the vessel of the human soul.
How this
And
is
if you disrespect those, then I
yeah,
think that,
no, that is not extreme. That would be completely typical.
yeah, I think
Doctor,
given that there's a lot of baggage to that, a lot of
I
theological baggage to that attached, I don't think that it would be extreme at all.
you
But
have
you
to
are
wonder
sorry.
how ignorant they are of Roman custom and law. People who wanted to be doctors had to go to the Colosseum and take people who were dying and vivisect them, cut them open still alive to learn about human anatomy because they were not allowed to dissect the dead.
Yeah.
You could torture a living person, but you could not violate the sanctity of a dead corpse. Okay?
Yes.
In what universe it would in that world, how is death for disturbing graves an extreme reaction? Now, Claudius, AD 41 to 54. That is actually pretty close to the time of the Jesus type thing. That would indicate that someone was disturbing graves around that time, probably. Or, well, again, if it's by the emperor, that would have been a decree for the entire Roman Empire that was then sent around. We've no reason to believe that this was specific to Judea. Indeed, this is apparently found in Nazareth, so that was to the north. That someone, no one should disturb graves. So somewhere in the Roman Empire, someone was disturbing graves, possibly grave robbing. Who knows? Maybe it was people trying to find the body of Jesus.
Yeah.
But the idea that the part that just made me laugh and realize how how desperate the people have to be making this argument is that they say their idea was that they wanted to stop alleged resurrections. Not grave robbers, not religious fanatics trying to figure out what happened to something. No, no, no. They wanted to edict against resurrections.
Yeah. Which is hilarious because that's totally necessary.
Yeah. I am the emperor. You will not get out of your grave. Stay dead, damn you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as Christopher Hitchens said in his debate with Frank Turek, actually, given the time and place, resurrections were something of a banality. So obviously, the emperor had to do something against that because people were resurrecting left and right.
Absolutely. There was that whole thing in Matthew where everyone got out of their tombs, but they waited for Jesus to come out. For everybody resurrected, but they hung around in their tombs for a couple
Yeah,
days to make sure Jesus got to come out first because he's a special snowflake.
yeah,
And even the undead want to make sure he feels special.
yeah. And I mean, it makes sense because when people now resurrect, then the population grows, and then you have more people to feed. So naturally, that had to be taken care of.
Of course, of course. You know, if they had put this as an argument in favor of position one, that there had been some fuss about an empty tomb, that would have made sense. Granted, as I say, it's from the emperor, so it could just be that they felt this was necessary for the empire as a whole because some people in some part of the Roman Empire were being weird about dead bodies and that was creepy to them and very, very wrong. So they did this. But at least conceivable that it could have been happening in Judea, that it could have been with relationship to Jesus. There's no reason to think it was, but it's not totally crazy to say that. But no. He doesn't want there to be any more resurrections.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's well, you know, forget Shaun of the Dead. Forget shovels and pickaxes. All we need to do is have an emperor make a decree, and that'll stop the zombie apocalypse. There we go. Come on, nerds.
I
Easy
would say
peasy.
that in summary, I don't think that, or I think we can both agree that given the time and place of this decree occurring, it was an extreme reaction. But even if it was, then a decree to stop people from resurrecting is rather silly.
You would
So,
think. But
yeah,
again, as you said, this is Christian apologetics, and Christian apologetics is nothing if not absurd. So
yeah.
here we go.
I think
And the last,
the
sorry, go
last
ahead.
piece, number nine, I think Jesus' tomb was never venerated as a shrine. I mean, I think we covered this sort of at the beginning, and I think we go full circle here. Well, duh, we don't know where the empty tomb was, or
There was no
we
empty
don't
tomb.
think
We
that
have no
there was
reason to
one.
believe there was ever an empty tomb of any kind. The
Yeah,
tomb was never venerated as a shrine. Now, I'd like to point
because
out
there
that
was
one
no
of
tomb.
the exactly one of the places that they think was the tomb of Jesus now, at least that the Orthodox hold as the tomb of Jesus, has veneration. Every Easter they go and there's this candle lighting, which is a magic trick that they say is God magically lighting candles around the room. It happens every year. So Christians now venerate a tomb. Actually, I think they venerate a couple of tombs. It depends on which group you're going with. But at the time, there was no one venerating it. So we have established that Christians would venerate a tomb because they do, and they didn't at the beginning. Maybe Occam's razor, simplest explanation, there was no fucking tomb to venerate.
Yeah,
So, yeah, thanks for disproving your argument, whoever wrote this article. You have very nicely demonstrated to us why there was no tomb. Good job. Bravo.
yeah. So, yeah, I think that pretty much covers it all, and those are pretty much a few of the reasons why we don't accept this article, and why I personally, and you would side there with me, I think why we don't think that was an empty tomb.
Yeah. Yeah. And all their, I mean, when a point can be given as evidence for either side of an argument and can even very, very reasonably, perhaps more reasonably, definitely more reasonably, be given against your point, then it's not evidence for your argument. I
Yeah,
just want to put that out there. It should be clearly indicative of your position and not at all indicative of the exact opposite position for you to hold a piece as evidence. So when you are citing evidence, remember Aaron Ra's definition. Evidence is a body of verifiable facts that are positively indicative of or exclusively concordant with one and only one hypothesis over any other.
Yeah.
And as Hitchens said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which we certainly have not seen here today.
Yeah. So, anyways, this was our take on the empty tomb. Next week, I think we will do something a little bit more lighthearted.
Oh, please. Please send us crazy Christian tweets. That would be so much fun.
Yeah.
Come on. Come on. We need a laugh.
Yeah. And also, if you find something from person, maybe not a Christian or something like that, that is also welcome. We will be glad to include those. But if you have any idea for a tweet which we should discuss, feel free to send it either to Lilith at Lilith Liberated on Twitter, to me at Renevelation on Twitter, or Renee, or at Veritas Voices, which is a Twitter account for our YouTube channel.
Please do. We love to hear from you, anyone. We are always happy to take questions from believers and unbelievers. If you think we're wrong in some of our points and you have a clear criticism, we'd love to hear about it and to know your sources if you have any additional information. So please, we are all about new information and hearing from people. But I think that pretty much covers the topic for today, at least. Thanks very much for bringing this article in, Renee. This was a good pick. Very interesting.
Yeah.
I'm now going to go put some ointment on my face palming wounds.
Yeah. Hope to recover.
Someday. Oh, anyway, have a wonderful week. We hope to hear from you again soon, and reason bless.